Dust clung to the boots of Calder Briggs as he walked the edge of the valley, shoulders hunched under the weight of too many years and not enough hope. His hands, rough from work and loss, hung at his sides like tools left too long in the sun. He was a widower, a once proud ranch hand reduced to patchwork jobs and borrowed meals. And that morning, all he had was the address scribbled on worn paper. Blue Hollow Farm, South Shed needs work. Ask for Evelyn. The farm looked quiet. Rows of fences faded by time, a windmill groaning in the breeze, and a crooked shed that slouched like it was apologizing for existing. Calder stepped through the front gate just as a woman rounded the corner, wiping her hands on a cloth. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, sleeves rolled up, and a confidence that didn't match the dusty porch. "Looking for Evelyn," he said. "You found her," she replied, stopping mid-step. Calder blinked. "You're Evelyn," she nodded. "And you must be Briggs. I was told you're good with wood and don't talk too much." "Both are true," he said, eyeing the shed. She offered a hand. "You fix it, I feed you." It was more than fair. He got to work before she finished her sentence. The shed was worse up close. Rotted beams, half a roof, and the kind of sag that meant water had gotten in a long time ago. Still, Calder didn't complain. He never did. Nails and splinters were easier than grief. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Evelyn watching him. Not hovering, not instructing, just curious. They didn't speak much that first day. She brought him water, a sandwich, a glance that lingered a little too long, and when the sun dipped low, casting amber light over the field, she leaned against the fence and asked, "Why'd you take this job?" He didn't look up. "Because my wife used to believe hard work meant something." Evelyn didn't flinch at the mention of his loss. Instead, she said, "Then let's make this work mean something." He nodded once and returned to the shed. That night, Evelyn stood alone on her porch, arms crossed. She watched the man she'd hired walk toward the edge of her land, unaware he was helping rebuild more than a building, and completely unaware she owned most of the valley below him. By the third day, Calder had the east wall standing straight again. He worked in silence, steady and focused. The kind of man who didn't need small talk to feel the weight of a job well done. Evelyn, meanwhile, watched him from the shade of the barn, arms folded, lips pressed into thought. She couldn't stop wondering why a man like him, clearly skilled, clearly proud, had no place to go but a broken shed and a borrowed sandwich. "Used to run a ranch outside Eden's Bluff," Calder said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. Evelyn raised a brow. "That so?" "Yeah. 40 acres, a few head of cattle, some good land. Belonged to my wife's family. After she passed, it just stopped making sense." She didn't ask for details. The ache in his voice said enough. "Sorry," she said, meaning it. He gave a slow nod. "Wasn't your doing." At lunch, they sat on crates outside the barn, sharing cornbread and coffee. Jonah, the old hound Evelyn never admitted was spoiled, lay between them, snoring. "You always live here?" Calder asked, glancing toward the farmhouse. Evelyn hesitated. "Not always. Grew up here, but I left for a time. Came back after my father passed." "You run it alone now?" She smirked. "Most days, yes. Some nights, too." He looked around. "Big place for one person." She met his eyes. "Bigger than most know." And still he didn't ask the question. Didn't pry about the stretch of fields she never seemed to harvest, or the well-kept fence rows that disappeared into land no one else touched, or the men who tipped their hats a little too low when they passed her in town. Because Calder didn't yet know that Evelyn Holt owned over 70,000 acres. Land passed down from generations of Harts and Holts, sealed with marriage, buried with secrets. To him, she was just a woman with a shed and strong coffee, and that was how she liked it. That evening, as he packed up his tools, she said, "You know you could stay in the old bunkhouse instead of walking in every morning." Calder raised an eyebrow. "Didn't figure I was welcome that long." Evelyn tilted her head. "If you're willing to work through the weekend, I might throw in supper, too." He paused, then gave her a rare, soft smile. "I never say no to supper." The shed still leaned. The shadows still stretched, but for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt quite so tilted. The old bunkhouse hadn't seen a tenant in years. Its floorboards creaked like they'd missed conversation, and the stove only worked if you begged it. But Calder didn't complain, not once. He unpacked his bedroll, lit the lantern Evelyn left him, and fell asleep to the sounds of night animals rustling in grass he hadn't known he'd missed. Morning started earlier now. Evelyn would rise before the sun, prepare coffee, and watch from the porch as Calder came out of the bunkhouse, already lacing his boots. By the end of the week, the shed had a new roof, reinforced beams, and a door that no longer dragged like it carried the weight of old memories. "You've done more in 6 days than I did in 6 months," Evelyn said, watching him run his hand across the fresh grain of wood. I've had practice, Calder said. When you fix things long enough, you learn to listen to what's wrong. She glanced at him. Do you listen to people that way too? He hesitated, then shrugged. Used to. That evening they sat at her kitchen table for the first time. Real supper. Roasted squash, stew, cornbread fresh from the iron skillet. Calder ate slow, almost reverent, as if food like this was rare in his world. Evelyn watched him from across the table. The lines on his face were hard-earned, and the scar above his wrist told of a life lived working, not running. You ever think about settling again? She asked. Calder wiped his mouth with the cloth napkin she'd folded for him. I stopped thinking about again a long time ago. But you still show up, still build, because it's the only thing that quiets the ghosts. She understood that more than she wanted to admit. They didn't speak for a while after that, just shared the stillness. And when he helped her with the dishes, elbow deep in soapy water, sleeves rolled up, he smiled for the second time that week. Not bad for a widower, huh? He said. Evelyn smirked. Better than some husbands I've known. Later that night, Calder walked back to the bunkhouse, hands in his pockets, moonlight guiding the path. He didn't know why her laugh echoed in his head, didn't know why her coffee tasted better than any he'd had in years, didn't know why her voice had started to fill the corners of the silence he'd once clung to. But he knew one thing. He wasn't just fixing a shed anymore. Something else, someone else, was starting to lean less. The next morning, Evelyn was already mending a fence when Calder joined her. She wore her old work gloves and a determined expression. Stray hair clung to her cheeks in the breeze, but she didn't seem to notice. You could have waited, he called as he approached, tossing his tool bag near her post. She glanced up. I could have, but some things fall apart faster if you ignore them. Calder didn't reply. Instead, he picked up a rail and began helping her without another word. They worked for hours side by side, the silence between them not uncomfortable but full. Evelyn spoke only when she needed to. Calder listened to every word like it mattered. You always do repairs yourself? He asked finally. Most of the time, she said. The land listens better to people who bleed for it. He looked at her then more closely than before. You're not like most ranchers I've met. Good, she said flatly. They tend to talk too much and dig too little. He chuckled, a low rumble that surprised even himself. When they broke for water, Calder leaned against a post and looked out across the vast stretch of pasture. You got a good place here. She followed his gaze, and for a moment, something shifted behind her eyes. Pride, grief, memory. Better than good, she said. But people assume it's just what they see. He looked at her. What don't they see? She hesitated. That it's mine. All of it? More than most know. Calder thought back to the men at the general store who spoke her name with quiet awe. To the bank teller who'd flinched when Evelyn Holt walked in. To the land, untouched, sprawling, boundless. You're not just a farmer, he said. She turned toward him, wiping sweat from her brow. And you're not just a handyman. Neither of them smiled. But the truth hung between them like the wire they'd strung. Taut, unspoken, undeniable. That night, Evelyn sat on the porch, boots kicked off, sipping sweet tea as the moon rose. Calder joined her, nodding as he settled in the chair beside hers. No supper tonight? He asked. I was hoping you'd offer to cook, she teased. He tilted his head. You trust me in your kitchen? I've seen you patch a roof. Can't be worse with potatoes. They sat in easy silence, two people slowly forgetting the years they had spent alone, and while neither of them said it, both felt it. Something was shifting. And this time, neither of them wanted to stop it. The kitchen felt different that night. Calder stood barefoot on the worn wooden floor, sleeves rolled up, chopping onions with the care of a man who knew what it meant to savor something. Evelyn leaned against the doorway, arms folded, not to supervise, but simply to watch. You really can cook, she said as he dropped diced potatoes into a bubbling pot. I managed after Clara passed, he replied, stirring gently. Figured if I didn't learn, I'd starve or go broke on biscuits. There was a pause. He rarely mentioned his late wife. Evelyn didn't press. She just nodded and handed him a pinch of salt. When they sat down to eat, the meal was simple. Beef stew, cornbread, and fresh greens from her garden. But Calder ate like it was a feast, eyes closing after the first bite. You put something special in here? She asked. He smirked. Care. She laughed, a soft, open sound that made Jonah the hound lift his head from the rug. Halfway through dinner, a knock echoed at the door. Evelyn stiffened. Calder noticed, but said nothing. She stood and opened it to reveal a tall man in a dark vest, spurs clinking as he stepped forward. His eyes flicked from her to Calder and back again. Evening, Evie, the man said with the tone of someone used to walking into places that weren't his. Evelyn's voice was cool. What do you want, Bryce? I heard you had company, he said, nodding toward Calder. Thought I'd see for myself. Calder stood slowly. shoulders broad and quiet. "Repairman," Evelyn said simply. "Supper guest, nothing more." Bryce let his gaze linger. There was history behind those eyes, and Calder didn't need to know the details to read the tension in Evelyn's jaw. "You know how people talk," Bryce said, stepping back. "Wouldn't want anyone thinking you're handing out more than just work." Evelyn didn't flinch. "I stopped caring what people think a long time ago." "Still," Bryce drawled, tipping his hat with mock politeness, "this land holds your name, but it used to hold mine, too." And with that, he walked off into the night. Evelyn closed the door harder than she meant to. Calder said nothing for a moment. Then softly, "You all right?" she exhaled. "Just an old suitor. One who's still bitter I didn't marry him when he thought I should. Looks like he's the kind who's used to owning things." She looked at Calder then, eyes clear. "I'm not a thing." He nodded. "Didn't think you were." Later, as Calder rinsed dishes in the sink, he asked, "He always talk to you like that?" "Only when he's drunk or lonely." "You want me to leave?" Evelyn paused. "No, I want you to stay. At least until the shed's done." They both knew the shed had been done days ago, but neither said it. Out on the porch that night, with Jonah at their feet and stars beginning to prick the velvet sky, Evelyn whispered something she hadn't said aloud in years. "I forgot what peace felt like." Calder didn't answer. He just reached over and let his fingers graze hers. Lightly, like testing if the moment was real. And Evelyn didn't pull away. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, quiet, steady, warm. Calder woke early, worked without complaint, and stayed late. Evelyn no longer waited on the porch for him. He was already there, fixing a gate, checking the barn, carrying in firewood she never asked for but always noticed. It wasn't just the shed anymore. It was the fences, the troughs, the windmill that hadn't spun right in 2 years. He was repairing more than her land. He was restoring the silence between her ribs. At dusk, Evelyn sat in the barn loft with a ledger in her lap and the sun setting behind her. Calder climbed the ladder like he belonged there. He didn't ask to join her. He just sat beside her and watched her write. "You're not just a farmer," he said finally. "No," she replied without looking up. "You're something else. Banker, maybe. Land baron." "Keep guessing," she said with a faint smile. He chuckled. "Well, it explains why folks flinch when they say your name." Evelyn closed the ledger. "It's not the land that bothers them, it's that a woman owns it." Silence. Then Calder asked, "Why me?" "What do you mean? Why let me stay? Why trust me with all this?" She met his eyes. "Because you don't treat it like it's owed to you." That night, Evelyn made cinnamon bread, the kind her mother used to bake after the first frost. The smell filled the house like memory. Calder took a slice, bit into it, and smiled without saying a word. "You remind me of this place," she said. "How so?" "Quiet, rough around the edges, but still standing." He looked down at the slice in his hand. "Is that your way of saying I'm dependable or just old?" "Maybe both." They laughed, and in that moment something shifted again. Deeper than comfort, softer than need. Later, as he prepared to head back to the bunkhouse, she followed him out to the porch. The moon was low, full, and honey-colored. "I'm not sure what's happening here," she said quietly. He turned to face her. "You want it to stop?" "No," she said. "I just don't want it to break." Calder stepped closer, not too close. "I don't build things just to watch them fall," he said. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then maybe. Don't rush." "I won't." And he meant it, because love, like fences on windswept land, had to be built strong and slow if it was going to last. It rained for 2 days straight, not the kind of gentle spring drizzle that coaxed wildflowers out of the soil, but a hard, relentless storm that turned dirt roads to soup and reminded everyone that nature didn't ask permission to disrupt your peace. Calder stayed in the main house during the worst of it, not because Evelyn asked, but because she hadn't. And he didn't need her to. They spent the hours tucked inside, sharing a hearth and silence that never felt hollow. He fixed the drafty window in her parlor. She mended his flannel shirt while he read aloud from a tattered novel they found behind the fireplace. At one point, Evelyn glanced up and asked, "Do you ever miss your old life?" Calder stared at the flames for a long moment. "Sometimes. Mostly the parts that don't exist anymore." "What about her?" she asked gently, meaning Clara. "I'll always miss her," he said. "But missing her doesn't mean I can't feel something again." That something hovered in the space between them, and neither of them reached to name it yet. The storm broke just before dawn on the third day. Evelyn walked out into the damp world and inhaled the scent of clean earth. Calder followed, his boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. The land glittered in the morning sun. Everything smelled new. "I haven't seen it this green in years," she said, turning slowly in the field. Calder smiled. "Water's funny that way, destroys and renews." "So are people," she murmured. He stepped closer, his voice low. "You think we're being renewed?" "I think—" She paused, searching the wide sky. I think I stopped hoping for that a long time ago. But now, maybe. They stood without touching, but something between them had already shifted. And then Evelyn said the thing she'd been holding like a dam in her chest. You should know, this land, the Holt Ranch, it's not just mine. Calder frowned. What do you mean? She took a breath. I own most of what you see from here to the western ridge. It's not just a patch of dirt and cattle. It's a legacy. One that men have tried to take. One I've defended. Alone. Calder didn't flinch. And you think I want a piece of it? She looked down. I think I'm scared that if I let someone in, they'll try. Calder's voice was firm but kind. Evelyn, I don't want your land. What do you want then? He held her gaze. You. The wind carried her breath away. Not because she didn't believe him, but because she did. And that terrified her more than any storm. The days after the storm felt different. Not just in the crispness of the air or the softness of the ground, but in the way Evelyn and Calder moved around each other. A quiet understanding had settled between them, warm and uncertain, like the first light after a long night. Calder continued his work, mending, hauling, checking fences. But now, he lingered, over coffee, over shared glances, over the quiet that no longer needed to be filled with anything but presence. Evelyn didn't ask him to leave, and he never needed to ask if he could stay. But comfort isn't always silent. It stirs things. It wakes ghosts. And on the 7th morning, one of those ghosts rode up the long dirt path in a black carriage with silver wheels and ambition painted into every crease of his suit. Lawrence Doran. Evelyn saw him from the porch and set down her coffee with a sigh. Calder stepped outside just as the carriage came to a halt. The driver, dressed finer than most ranch hands ever dreamed, stepped down and opened the door. Lawrence emerged with a smirk. Evie, he said, brushing non-existent dust from his sleeves. Still playing ranch queen, I see. Evelyn crossed her arms. Still pretending you care about courtesy? Calder remained silent, watching from the edge of the porch. Lawrence's eyes flicked to him. And you are? Someone who doesn't take kindly to snakes on porches, Calder replied evenly. Lawrence chuckled. You always had a taste for rough edges, Evelyn. She stepped down, facing him directly. What do you want? Lawrence's smile faded. I want what's mine. Nothing here is yours, Evelyn said, voice low and sharp. The land north of the creek, the contracts, the debts your father never cleared. You know that was settled years ago. He shrugged. Legal matters can be flexible, especially when someone like me is willing to push. Calder stepped down beside Evelyn now. She's not alone, he said. Lawrence tilted his head, amused. And you think that changes anything? No, Calder said, but it changes you if you try something. After a tense silence, Lawrence smiled again. More cruel this time. We'll see about that. And with that, he turned back to his carriage and was gone in a cloud of dust. Evelyn didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she whispered, He was once supposed to marry me. Calder blinked. You? She nodded. It was arranged, a merger of land and power. But I refused. I chose freedom instead. And now he wants revenge. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, Calder lit the lamps a little earlier. Evelyn didn't sit on the porch. She stayed inside, fingers tight around her old family ledger. When Calder came in, he didn't ask questions. He just sat beside her, close but not pressing. I'm not going anywhere, he said simply. Her voice was hoarse. That's what scares me. He turned to her, gentle but steady. I'm not him, Evelyn, and I don't want to own a thing. You want me? I want to walk beside you. She closed the ledger. Tears didn't fall, but her hands trembled slightly. I've held this ranch for years. Fought off banks, suitors, rustlers. But I don't know how to let someone in. You just did, he said softly. And then, carefully, he took her hand in both of his. And for the first time in a long, long time, Evelyn didn't pull away. The following week passed like the calm before a summer storm, too quiet to be comforting. Evelyn went about her routines, checking crops, reviewing contracts, tending her land with the practiced grace of a woman who'd led alone for too long. But Calder noticed it in the way she held her shoulders tighter, in the way she paused before speaking, always listening for footsteps that hadn't come yet. Lawrence Doran had not returned, but he didn't have to, not yet. His threat lingered like a thundercloud on the edge of a clear sky. One morning, Calder found her in the barn, standing over a locked trunk she hadn't opened in years. Inside were letters, old maps, a copy of a deed with her father's name burned across it, and an envelope sealed in red wax. She looked up at him as if caught. I didn't know if I'd ever open this again, she whispered. It's my father's final instructions, in case the land was ever contested. Calder stepped closer. Does it help you? I don't know, she said. But if Lawrence pushes this into court, I might need every scrap of proof I have. They spent the afternoon cataloging the documents. Calder never asked what the numbers meant, or why her father had buried half the land in shadow corporations and hidden shares. But he saw it in her eyes. Evelyn Holt hadn't just inherited a ranch. She'd inherited a legacy built on fire and grit, and now someone wanted to burn it all down. That evening, while fixing a broken hinge on the barn door, Calder caught sight of a rider in the distance. Fast, dust rising behind him like smoke. By the time the man reached the ranch house, Evelyn was already on the porch. "Miss Holt," he called, breathless. "It's the lawyer from Wexler County. He just posted notice. Lawrence Doran filed a claim on the North Borderland." Evelyn's face was stone. "Then it's begun." Inside, Calder watched her unroll a map on the table. She pointed to the disputed territory. Land she'd let rest for years because it bordered a dry riverbed. Useless to most, but now, suddenly, valuable to someone who wanted a legal foothold. "If he gets that, he'll drag everything else into question," she muttered. Calder asked, "Can you stop him?" "Maybe, if the town council doesn't fold." He looked at her. "Then we go to town." She hesitated. "You don't owe me that fight, Calder." He straightened. "No, I owe it to myself, to stand with you." 2 days later, they rode into Wexler. The town buzzed with whispers. At the council building, Evelyn walked in wearing her father's old hat and boots. Calder followed at her side, not in front, not behind, just beside her. Inside, Lawrence sat with a smirk and a hired lawyer in a three-piece suit too clean for a cattle town. "Well," Lawrence said smoothly, "you brought company." Evelyn didn't flinch. "I brought a witness." "And who is he, hired help?" She met his gaze with steel. "He's someone who doesn't mistake power for possession." The hearing was short. Lawrence presented his claim, an old contract between her father and a defunct cattle syndicate. But Evelyn, steady as ever, laid down the chain of ownership, deed copies, and the sealed letter her father had signed. The room grew still as the judge read. Then he looked up. "This claim is invalid," he declared. "The land remains in the possession of Miss Evelyn Holt." Outside, Lawrence stopped them. "You think this is over?" he hissed. Evelyn stepped forward, eyes blazing. "No, Lawrence, I know it is." That night, back at the ranch, Calder handed her a mug of warm cider and sat beside her on the steps. "You did it," he said. She looked out across the moonlit pasture. "We did." And in the hush that followed, he reached for her hand again. This time, she didn't just hold it. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Autumn crept slowly across the land, brushing gold and amber over every field. For the first time in years, Evelyn allowed herself to breathe. Not just survive, not just endure, but truly live. The threats to her land had quieted, the false claims extinguished like dying embers. And standing beside her through every hard step was Calder, steady, quiet, and more than a hired hand. He never asked for a title, never demanded a place, and yet he had found both. One afternoon, as she watched him mend a fence along the eastern ridge, Evelyn saw something that caught her breath. He paused to pet a calf that had wandered too close. His expression softened. The wind played through his hair, and the sunlight framed him like a portrait. He belonged there, not as a guest, but as part of the story. Later, back at the house, she baked for the first time in months, something her mother once made, apple biscuits with cinnamon. The scent filled the house. Calder walked in, sniffed the air, and froze in the doorway. "You baked?" She nodded, half shy. It felt like a day for something warm. He took a bite and looked at her with a slow, crooked smile. "I think this is the best thing I've tasted since last winter." She chuckled. "You say that every time I cook." "That's because it's always true." They sat across from each other at the table, an oil lamp flickering between them. And then, without warning or ceremony, Calder said, "I've been thinking about staying." Evelyn's hand stilled on her mug. "You already are. I mean permanently," he said, eyes steady. "I've got nothing pulling me away, and everything good in my life lately is here." Her breath caught. He leaned forward. "But not if it makes things harder for you. I won't add weight you don't want." She shook her head slowly. "You're not a weight. You're the only thing that's ever made this place feel like more than a fortress." Then softly, almost too softly to hear, "You make it feel like home." That night, under a sky full of stars, they walked the land together. No declarations, no vows. Just two people moving side by side, finally in step, finally unafraid. A week later, Calder moved his few belongings into the spare room of the main house. Evelyn didn't rush anything. She didn't need to. Some roots grow slowly, deeply, and the strongest ones never ask for permission. The final frost came early that year, but inside the house it was warm. And for the first time since the Holt family name was etched into the land, Evelyn didn't feel alone.